At 26,000 feet over western Germany, the sky was thin, silent, and lethal. The temperature outside the cockpit was well below freezing, the oxygen mask pressed tightly against the pilot's face, and the horizon stretched endlessly in pale blue and white. Below, enemy territory extended for hundreds of miles. There would be no friendly airfields, no rescue aircraft, no second chances at hunting. The engine stopped. There was no explosion, no dramatic flash, just silence. For a fighter pilot, silence was worse than fire. The Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine of the P-51 Mustang was the most reliable power plant in the American arsenal. It gave the aircraft speed, range, and altitude unmatched by anything the Luftwaffe could field in 1944. It was the reason bombers finally had long-range escort. It was the reason German fighter losses skyrocketed. And now it was dead. The preparation vanished. The aircraft, flying at over 400 miles per hour moments earlier, became a glider suspended above hostile ground. The pilot did not panic. Panic came later, if at all. He pushed the nose down instinctively, trading altitude for airspeed, fighting the sudden stall that killed so many men in those first seconds after engine failure. Training took over. Hands moved automatically. Magnetos, mixture, throttle, primer, nothing. The engine did not come back. This was not a mechanical inconvenience. At 26,000 feet over Germany, engine failure was almost always fatal, either in the air or on the ground. The P-51 Mustang was not built to glide long distances safely. Its long wings were optimized for speed, not endurance. Without power, the aircraft descended fast. Every 1,000 feet lost brought the pilot closer to anti-aircraft fire, German patrols, and capture. The pilot checked his oxygen supply. Still good for now. He looked left and right. The bomber stream was gone. His squadron was gone. The sky that had been crowded with contrails minutes earlier was now empty. He was alone. Being alone over Germany in 1944 meant something very specific. It meant that every German unit on the ground would fire at you. It meant that any Luftwaffe pilot still airborne would hunt you. It meant that if you survived the landing, you would become a prisoner or worse. The pilot calculated quickly. At best glide speed, the Mustang could manage roughly 2 miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude. At 26,000 feet, that gave him perhaps 50 miles if everything went perfectly. Germany was far wider than that. He adjusted the trim and held the aircraft steady, careful not to bleed speed. The Mustang descended in a long, shallow arc, silent except for wind rushing over the canopy. Without engine noise, the aircraft felt unnatural, exposed. That silence gave him time to think, too much time. He thought of the briefing earlier that morning. The weather, the road, the warnings about flak concentrations near the target area, the reminder that escort fighters were not to chase enemy aircraft deep toward the ground. Stay high. Stay with the bombers. He had followed orders, and still this was where he ended up. As the aircraft passed through 22,000 feet, the pilot scanned the ground for anything resembling a usable field. Roads were dangerous, too many soldiers, too many witnesses. Forests meant death, towns meant capture, rivers were unpredictable and often fatal. Fields were his only chance. The problem was that German farmland was crisscrossed with fences, ditches, and trees. From altitude, they looked deceptively smooth. On the ground, they tore aircraft apart. At 20,000 feet, the first flak bursts appeared below him. Black puffs rising lazily, then rapidly, as gunners realized a lone aircraft was descending without power. A damaged fighter was a gift. Every gun in range would try to finish it. He altered course slightly, slipping sideways in the air. Careful not to stall, the Mustang responded sluggishly without power. Control inputs had to be precise. Overcorrection meant a spin. A spin at this altitude meant death. The pilot considered bailing out. The P-51's cockpit was cramped. Exiting at high speed was dangerous. At lower altitude, parachutes often failed to deploy fully. Even if he made it to the ground alive, capture was almost guaranteed. At 15,000 feet, German fighters appeared. 2 specks at first. Then the unmistakable silhouettes of Foch. Wolf 190s climbing hard, drawn by the sight of an American fighter falling helplessly through their airspace. They did not fire immediately. They circled, cautious, aware that even a damaged Mustang could still kill them. The pilot had no ammunition advantage. His guns were useless without an engine to maneuver. He could not climb. He could not fight. He could only descend. He pushed the nose down slightly, increasing speed, using gravity as his last weapon. The Mustang surged forward faster than expected, and one of the German fighters overshot, flashing past his canopy in a blur of gray and black crosses. That mistake bought him seconds. Seconds mattered. At 10,000 feet, flak intensified. Bursts bracketed his glide path. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage. One piece punched through the wing, but the aircraft held. The pilot's hands were numb from cold. His breathing was heavy inside the mask. The ground was coming up fast now, details sharpening: roads, farmhouses, tree lines. He chose a field. It was long, slightly sloped, empty. At 5,000 feet, the German fighters broke off. They had done their job. Gravity would finish the rest. The pilot lowered the landing gear. The wheels locked down with a reassuring clunk, a small victory in a day filled with failures. He aligned the aircraft carefully, holding just above stall speed, riding the last of his altitude like a razor's edge. Too fast and he would flip. Too slow and he would drop hard. The Mustang crossed the fence at the edge of the field. The wheels touched. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled. Dirt and grass exploded around the cockpit. The pilot fought the controls, keeping the wings level as the aircraft skidded to a halt. Silence again. But this time he was alive. The moment the Mustang stopped moving, the pilot knew the most dangerous phase had begun. Flying over enemy territory was deadly. Being on the ground inside it was worse. He shut off the remaining electrical switches and reached instinctively for the canopy release. Training manuals emphasized one rule above all others after a forced landing in hostile territory: get out immediately. A disabled aircraft attracted attention. Smoke, skid marks, and broken fences could be seen from miles away. German patrols responded fast. The canopy slid back with a metallic scrape. Cold air rushed into the cockpit, carrying the smell of burned oil and crushed grass. The pilot climbed out quickly, boots sinking into soft soil. He grabbed his sidearm, checked that it was loaded, and scanned the tree line. No soldiers yet. No civilians either. That was both good and bad. Civilians meant witnesses. Witnesses meant German police, Volkssturm units, or worse. But empty farmland often meant patrols would arrive soon. Fields like this were watched carefully. Allied pilots did not land by accident. The pilot made his decision in seconds. He ran. Leaving the aircraft felt wrong. The Mustang had brought him this far. It had saved his life. But staying with it guaranteed capture. German doctrine emphasized securing downed Allied airmen quickly, not only to gather intelligence, but to prevent escape networks from activating. He crossed the field at a crouched sprint, angling toward a narrow hedgerow that cut across the countryside like a scar. The hedges were thick, overgrown, difficult to move through, exactly why they offered cover. By the time he reached it, his lungs burned and his legs shook from adrenaline and altitude sickness. He forced himself through the brush and dropped flat on the other side, listening. The sky above was no longer silent. Distant engines echoed German vehicles, perhaps motorcycles or trucks. The crash landing had been seen. There was no doubt about that. The pilot pulled out his silk escape map, a thin fabric printed with roads, rivers, and rail lines. He oriented it quickly. He knew where he was now, somewhere between Frankfurt and Kassel, deep inside Germany. The nearest Allied lines were hundreds of miles away. Escape was nearly impossible. But pilots were trained to try anyway. He removed his flight jacket insignia and tucked it into his pocket. Anything that marked him as an American officer increased the risk of execution if captured by irregular forces. The Luftwaffe generally treated prisoners according to convention. The same could not be said for local militia or civilians whose towns had been bombed. He moved slowly now, using the hedgerows to mask his progress, keeping low and avoiding open ground. Every farmhouse could hide an informant. Every road could carry a patrol. Every barking dog could betray him. Within minutes, the sounds of search activity grew louder. Voices carried in German orders shouted. He heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire, warning shots fired into the air to signal others. They were close. The pilot crawled into a shallow drainage ditch and lay still, pressing himself into the mud as footsteps passed nearby. He held his breath, counting silently, forcing his heart rate down. Training again. A German soldier stopped near the ditch. The pilot could see boots, mud-caked, inches away. The soldier paused, then moved on. Minutes passed, then more. The search expanded outward, German discipline efficient and methodical. They worked in overlapping patterns, tightening the net. The pilot knew this could not last forever. Eventually, he would be found, exhausted, hungry, alone. He had one chance. As night approached, the activity shifted. Patrols spread out, relying more on roads and villages. Darkness made coordination harder. The pilot waited until full dusk before moving again, slipping deeper into the countryside. By midnight, he was miles from the crash site, but still hopelessly trapped behind enemy lines. He found shelter beneath a stand of trees and waited for dawn, cold and hungry, replaying the moment the engine died over and over in his mind. In the morning, it ended. A farmer spotted him crossing a field. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or desperation, the man alerted authorities. By midday, German soldiers surrounded him. There was no escape this time. The pilot raised his hands. He was disarmed, searched, and marched away under guard. He did not resist. Resistance would only get him killed. His war, at least for now, was over. At the interrogation center, Luftwaffe officers questioned him calmly, professionally. They asked about his unit, his mission, his squadron. He gave name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. They already knew enough. His aircraft wreckage told them the rest. From there, he was transported east, then north, then east again, passed from one camp to another, finally arriving at a prisoner of war camp filled with familiar faces. Bomber crews, fighter pilots, men who had survived impossible odds in the air, only to be grounded by fate. They shared stories. Many began the same way. At altitude, the engine stopped. The pilot learned that he was not alone. Dozens of Mustangs had been lost that year to mechanical failure, flak damage, or fuel starvation. Escort missions were long. Engines were pushed hard. Survival was never guaranteed, but he had lived. Months later, as Allied forces advanced and German control collapsed, the camp was liberated. American troops arrived, thin, exhausted, but unmistakably friendly. The war that had nearly killed him was finally ending. Years later, when asked about the most terrifying moment of his service, the pilot did not mention flak, or dogfights, or German aces. He spoke of silence. The silence at 26,000 feet, when the engine stopped and the sky suddenly became the most dangerous place in the world. The war ended less than a year after his engine failed at 26,000 feet, but for the pilot that moment never ended at all. When Allied forces overran the prisoner of war camps in the spring of 1945, liberation came quietly. There were no parades, no speeches, no music. American soldiers arrived in trucks and half-tracks, thin themselves, exhausted, weapons slung casually as if unsure whether the war had truly stopped. The gates opened. Guards vanished, and men who had spent months waiting simply stepped outside. For the pilot, freedom felt unreal. His body had survived captivity, but his mind was still at altitude, still listening for the sound of an engine that might never come back. Even as he was processed, debriefed, and eventually flown home, the memory of silence followed him. After the war, he returned to a country that had moved on quickly. Victory parades filled the streets. Newspapers celebrated aces and heroes. Stories focused on triumph, speed, and dominance in the air. Few wanted to hear about the moments when machines failed and survival depended not on skill alone, but on restraint, luck, and discipline. He did not talk much about the incident. When asked, he described it simply: engine forced landing captured. Survived. The details stayed with him unspoken. Yet those details matter. The P-51 Mustang had come to symbolize American air superiority in Europe. It was fast, long-range, deadly, but it was also pushed to its limits daily. Escort missions stretched engines for hours at high altitude. Fuel calculations were tight. Mechanical tolerance left little margin for error. The aircraft was magnificent and unforgiving. By 1944, dozens of Mustangs were being lost not to enemy fighters, but to fatigue, flak damage, fuel starvation, and engine failure. Many pilots never made it to the ground. They spun in. They blacked out. They vanished into forests or cities without witnesses. Their stories were never recorded. This pilot's story survived because he did. In later years, as historians studied the air war over Europe, they began to understand that survival was often determined not by heroics, but by calm decisions made in seconds. Pilots who reacted violently to engine failure stalled and died. Pilots who tried to fight gravity instead of working with it lost control. Those who survived understood glide ratios, airspeed, and patience. The pilot's survival at 26,000 feet was not a miracle. It was training, discipline, and restraint applied under absolute pressure. When asked decades later what he remembered most clearly, he did not describe fear. He described clarity. The moment when everything unnecessary disappeared. The moment when altitude, airspeed, and ground became the only things that mattered. He remembered how the aircraft felt without power, how the controls grew heavy, how every movement required intention, how the world below seemed impossibly far away and then suddenly too close. He remembered the soundlessness. That silence became his reference point for the rest of his life. Whenever engines roared or machines vibrated or crowds grew loud, his mind returned briefly to that quiet descent over enemy territory, to the knowledge that nothing else was coming to save him, that survival depended entirely on what he did next. For many veterans, the war ended in May 1945. For others, it ended much later. And for some, it never fully ended at all. The pilot lived a long life. He raised a family. He worked, he grew old. But every time he saw a Mustang at an air show, every time he heard the Merlin engine start, he listened differently than the crowd around him. They heard power, he heard absence. Because he had known what it meant when that sound disappeared at 26,000 feet over enemy territory, and how close the sky came to killing him when it did. And that is why this story matters. Not because it is spectacular, not because it ends in victory or destruction, but because it reveals the thin line between survival and loss in the air war over Europe, a line measured not in miles or minutes, but in calm decisions made when everything else has failed. At 26,000 feet, his engine died, and in the silence that followed, he lived.